What does it mean to be a prodigy? To have the world look at you and declare, "This is the one." For Freddy Adu, that question defined his life before he even became a teenager. He wasn't just a footballer, he was the footballer, hailed as the future of the sport. But how did it all begin? How did a boy from Ghana become America's great footballing hope? Freddy Adu's story starts in Tema, Ghana, a port city brimming with energy and life. Born on June 2nd, 1989, Adu spent the first 8 years of his life kicking a ball around the dusty streets of his hometown. It was clear early on that Freddy wasn't like the other kids. His speed, agility, and flair with the ball set him apart. He had a gift, a spark of genius that couldn't be taught. In 1997, Adu's family won the U.S. Green Card Lottery, a twist of fate that would forever alter the course of his life. They settled in Maryland, where Freddy's talent began to attract serious attention. Coaches marveled at his ability to outplay kids twice his age. At just 10 years old, Adu was dominating local tournaments and making headlines as a once-in-a-generation talent. By the time Freddy turned 13, he was already playing in international youth tournaments with the U.S. under-17 team. Scouts from Europe's biggest clubs, including Manchester United and Inter Milan, were lining up to sign him. But it wasn't just his skills that captured attention. It was his poise, his maturity beyond his years. Freddy Adu wasn't just a footballer. He was a story, a sensation, a brand waiting to happen. The buzz reached its peak in 2003 when Adu signed with Major League Soccer's DC United at just 14 years old. The deal was historic. He became the youngest professional athlete in American team sports since 1887, breaking records and igniting the imagination of fans across the country. For a nation still struggling to embrace soccer, Freddy Adu was a godsend. The media frenzy was unprecedented. Freddy appeared on talk shows, in commercials, and on magazine covers. He starred in Nike ads alongside icons like Ronaldinho and Thierry Henry. He was called the next Pelé, a title that weighed heavily even before he kicked a ball professionally. Expectations weren't just high, they were astronomical. But for Freddy, this was just the beginning. In his debut season with DC United, he showcased glimpses of brilliance, scoring his first professional goal at the age of 14. The stadium erupted, fans chanted his name, and the legend of Freddy Adu seemed to be on its way. Behind the scenes, however, cracks were already forming. As talented as Adu was, he was still a child playing in a league full of experienced, physically imposing men. The physicality of Major League Soccer was brutal, and Adu struggled to adjust. While his technical skills were undeniable, his ability to withstand the grind of a professional season was another story. Still, the hype machine kept rolling. Adu's performances were scrutinized at every turn. If he didn't score or deliver a dazzling assist, critics pounced. Every touch of the ball was dissected, every misstep magnified. For a 14-year-old, it was an impossible standard to meet, yet Freddy persevered, showing flashes of his potential and reminding the world why he had been dubbed a prodigy in the first place. As Adu's fame grew, so did the pressure. By the end of his first season, it was clear that his development wasn't progressing as smoothly as everyone had hoped. The very thing that had made him a sensation, his youth, was now becoming a liability. Critics questioned whether he had been pushed into the spotlight too soon. And then came the pivotal moment, Europe. By the time Freddy turned 18, he had outgrown the MLS, not in skill, but in perception. To fulfill his destiny as the next Pelé, he needed to prove himself on the world's biggest stage. When Benfica, one of Portugal's top clubs, came calling in 2007, it seemed like the perfect opportunity. Adu's move to Benfica was seen as a chance to restart, to finally fulfill the promise that had defined his career so far. But little did he know, his European adventure would mark the beginning of his fall from grace. When Freddy Adu signed with Benfica in 2007, it felt like a new chapter, a chance to silence the critics and fulfill the lofty expectations set for him as a teenager. Europe had long been seen as the proving ground for the world's best footballers, and Adu's move to Portugal was heralded as the start of his ascension to greatness. But instead of taking flight, his career began to unravel in ways no one could have predicted. Benfica's expectations were high, but so were Freddy's challenges. At just 18 years old, he was thrown into a completely new environment, new culture, new language, new style of play. Unlike in MLS, where his raw talent was enough to stand out, Europe demanded more. Tactical awareness, physical resilience, and mental toughness were prerequisites, and Adu quickly found himself struggling to adapt. In his first season, Adu showed flashes of brilliance, scoring a handful of goals in limited appearances, but those moments were overshadowed by his inability to secure a consistent spot in the starting lineup. Benfica's squad was stacked with seasoned professionals, and Adu's inexperience became glaringly apparent. The coaches saw him as a work in progress, not the immediate impact player they'd hoped for. As Adu's opportunities dwindled, the club decided to send him out on loan, a chance to gain experience and prove himself. Over the next few years, Adu embarked on a whirlwind tour of European clubs, But instead of finding stability, he fell deeper into obscurity. His first stop was AS Monaco in France's Ligue 1. The move was meant to sharpen his skills against some of Europe's toughest competition, but it was anything but smooth. Adu struggled to break into the team, making only a handful of appearances before being sent back to Benfica. Next came loans to lesser-known clubs like Belenenses in Portugal, Aris in Greece, and Çaykur Rizespor in Turkey. Each move felt like a step down, a demotion from the spotlight he had once commanded. At every club, the story was the same. Flashes of talent, but no consistency. Coaches and fans began to lose faith, and Adu's confidence seemed to waver with every setback. So what went wrong? Many point to Adu's inability to adapt to the European style of play. His technical skills were never in doubt, but football in Europe required much more than flair. Tactical discipline, defensive work rate, and a deeper understanding of the game's nuances were crucial, and these were areas where Adu fell short. Others argue that Adu was simply a victim of overexposure. By the time he arrived in Europe, the next Pelé label had become a burden rather than a badge of honor. Opponents relished the chance to prove the hype wrong, while teammates and coaches grew weary of the constant media attention surrounding him. But the challenges weren't just on the pitch. Adu's personal life also played a role in his struggles. Adapting to life in foreign countries at such a young age was no small feat. The language barriers, cultural differences, and isolation from friends and family took a toll. For a teenager who had already spent years in the spotlight, the pressure became overwhelming. By 2011, Adu's European adventure had come to an end. With no permanent club willing to take a chance on him, he returned to the United States, signing with the Philadelphia Union in MLS. For many, it felt like a homecoming, a chance to rebuild his career in a familiar setting. But even then, the magic that had once defined Freddy Adu seemed to have disappeared. Despite his struggles, Adu refused to give up. His passion for the game remained, and he continued to pursue opportunities wherever they arose. He bounced around leagues and clubs across the globe, playing in places as far-flung as Brazil, Finland, and Serbia. But the dream of becoming a global superstar was long gone. Freddy Adu's European journey wasn't just a setback, it was a turning point. It exposed the cracks in his game, his preparation, and perhaps even the way he was marketed as a prodigy. For a player who was once destined for greatness, Europe became the stage where his flaws were laid bare. Freddy Adu's return to Major League Soccer in 2011 was supposed to be a redemption arc. After years of struggling to find his footing in Europe, signing with the Philadelphia Union offered a chance to reset and reconnect with the league that had once made him a star. But what happens when even a homecoming doesn't go as planned? For a brief moment, it felt like Adu might reclaim his lost promise. His return to MLS was met with cautious optimism, and Philadelphia gave him a platform to showcase his talent. Under manager Piotr Nowak, who had previously coached Adu at DC United, the hope was that familiarity would help him rediscover his spark. And at first, there were glimpses of the Freddy Adu everyone remembered. The dribbling flair, the clever passes, the confidence on the ball, it was all there in flashes. But flashes weren't enough. In a league that had grown more competitive since Adu's teenage years, inconsistency became his Achilles heel. For every brilliant play, there were several games where Adu struggled to make an impact. By the end of his 2-year stint with the Union, the writing was on the wall. Adu wasn't the transformative player Philadelphia had hoped for, and his performances weren't enough to justify his high salary. The club eventually released him, leaving Adu without a team once again. For many players, this might have been the end of the road, but Freddy Adu wasn't ready to give up. He embarked on what can only be described as a footballing odyssey, a journey through some of the sport's most obscure corners in search of a fresh start. His next stop, Bahia, Brazil. The move seemed promising on paper. Brazil, after all, is a footballing powerhouse. But once again, Adu struggled to adapt. His time at Bahia was short-lived, and he left without making a significant impact. From there, Adu's career became a whirlwind of short stints in leagues around the world. He played in Serbia with Jagodina, in Finland with QPS, and even in the second division of the United States with the Tampa Bay Rowdies. Each move carried the hope of revival, but none of them lasted long. Off the pitch, Adu's story was becoming more complex. The boy wonder who had once graced magazine covers was now a journeyman, bouncing from club to club in search of stability. The media, which had once celebrated him as a prodigy, now labeled him a bust. For Adu, the narrative was difficult to escape, but what set Adu apart wasn't just his talent, it was his resilience. Despite the setbacks, the criticism, and the dwindling opportunities, Adu never walked away from the game. "I still love football," he said in a 2017 interview. "It's been a crazy ride, but I'm not done yet." Even as he struggled to find a long-term home, Adu remained committed to the sport. He trained tirelessly, took on trials with various clubs, and kept chasing the dream that had defined his life. It wasn't about proving the doubters wrong anymore, it was about proving to himself that he could keep going. As Adu entered his late 20s, the dream of being a global superstar had faded, but his story continued to resonate. For fans who had followed his journey from the beginning, Adu represented more than just a footballer. He was a reminder of how fleeting fame can be, how fragile the path to greatness truly is. His story also raised questions about the pressures placed on young athletes. Was Adu a victim of his own hype, or was he let down by the system that marketed him as a savior before he was ready? Could things have been different if he had been allowed to develop at his own pace? As Adu drifted away from the professional spotlight, his name became a metaphor for unfulfilled potential. Yet to paint him as a failure misses the bigger picture. Freddy Adu achieved things that most players can only dream of. He became an international sensation, represented his country at the highest level, and inspired countless young players to believe in their dreams. But what Adu's journey teaches us goes beyond the highlights and the accolades. The first lesson is the danger of labels. Being called the next Pelé might seem like an honor, but for Adu, it became a prison. Every move he made, every touch of the ball, was measured against the impossible standard of one of the greatest players in history. The truth is, Freddy Adu wasn't Pelé. He was Freddy Adu, a uniquely talented player with his own path to follow. The pressure to meet such an unrealistic comparison weighed heavily on him, and it's a cautionary tale for how we elevate young talents. The second lesson is about timing. Adu's rise came at a time when American soccer was desperate for a star, someone to lead the sport into mainstream acceptance. MLS capitalized on Adu's potential to market him as a savior, but the rush to turn him into a global superstar came at a cost. Instead of being given time to grow and develop naturally, Adu was thrust into the deep end. It's a reminder that talent alone isn't enough. Players need nurturing, mentorship, and patience. And finally, there's the lesson of resilience. Freddy Adu's story could have ended the moment the headlines stopped, but it didn't. He kept playing, kept chasing his love for the game, even as the world turned its back on him. Adu's determination, even in the face of setbacks, is a testament to his character. He refused to let the narrative define him, and that's something to admire. In recent years, Adu has stepped away from the spotlight, focusing on personal growth and new opportunities. While his playing days may be behind him, his story still resonates. Freddy Adu wasn't just a footballer, he was a symbol of the hopes and dreams of an entire generation. And even though his career didn't reach the heights many expected, his impact on the sport is undeniable. So, where does Freddy Adu's story leave us? It leaves us reflecting on the fine line between potential and pressure, talent and expectation. It reminds us that football isn't just about trophies and accolades, it's about the journey, the lessons, and the love for the game. Freddy Adu might not have become the greatest player in the world, but he taught us something more important: to find joy in the game, to keep going even when the odds are against you, and to remember that success is about more than just the headlines.